West Caribbean 708. West Caribbean Airways was a Colombian charter carrier founded in 1998, headquartered in Medellin. By the summer of 2005, it was operating a single airworthy McDonnell Douglas MD-82. The other two aircraft in its fleet had been grounded for maintenance the company could not afford to pay for. In the months before the accident, Colombian authorities had fined the airline twice for safety violations, once for overloading a flight, once for failing to maintain proper training records and crew rest requirements. The airline had also experienced a fatal crash in March 2005, when a LET L-410 went down after takeoff from the island of Providencia. Flight 708 departed Panama City at 0558 UTC on August 16, 2005. The MD-82 climbed normally and leveled at flight level 310. 16 minutes later, the crew initiated a climb to flight level 330, the aircraft's assigned cruise altitude. At 0649 UTC, something changed. The airspeed began decreasing from Mach 0.76. The horizontal stabilizer trim moved from 2 units nose up to 4 units nose up. The aircraft was trimming to try to maintain altitude as it slowed. At 0651 UTC, the crew checked in with Caracas Control over the Cedos waypoint. They discussed weather in the area, including possible icing, and requested a descent to FL 310. The request was approved. The autopilot was disconnected, but as the aircraft descended through FL 315, airspeed continued to fall rather than recover. The engines, registering declining pressure ratios, approached flight idle. 2 minutes later, the crew declared both engines had flamed out, though investigators later determined this was not accurate. The aircraft had entered an aerodynamic stall, and the crew appears to have misdiagnosed the situation as an engine failure. The cockpit voice recorder captured the crew attempting multiple engine restart procedures during the descent. What they did not do was execute the correct recovery from an aerodynamic stall at high altitude, primarily pitching the nose down to recover airspeed and loading the wings. At 0701 UTC, the radar return disappeared. The aircraft had impacted terrain at a cattle ranch near Machiquis at a descent rate of approximately 7,000 feet per minute. All 160 people on board were killed. The investigation, led by Venezuela's JIAAC, with analytical support from France's BEA, concluded that the crew had failed to maintain minimum airspeed at cruise altitude, failed to identify the stall correctly, and failed to execute stall recovery. Contributing factors included deficiencies in the airline's training program, specifically simulator training that did not include high-altitude stall recognition or recovery procedures, and the financial and psychological pressure placed on the crew by the airline's deteriorating operating conditions. In the weeks before the accident, crew members had reportedly not received regular paychecks. The crew of Flight 708 was almost denied departure from their previous stop because the airline had not paid its catering bills. What the investigation could not fully resolve was the precise internal decision-making sequence that led the crew to attempt engine restart procedures rather than stall recovery. The MD-82's behavior during a high-altitude stall shares some instrument signatures with an engine compressor stall, or flameout, and the crew's communications suggest they held that belief. Whether that belief was formed from a specific instrument reading, an ambiguous warning, or from cognitive patterns shaped by training that only covered engine failures, not aerodynamic stalls at altitude, was noted in the report but not definitively answered. The crew training records showed they had never practiced high-altitude stall recovery. But why neither pilot re-evaluated the situation during 4 minutes of continuous descent remains an open behavioral question in the documented record. Helios 522. Helios Airways was a Cypriot low-cost carrier, operating scheduled and charter services within Europe. Flight 522 was a scheduled service from Larnaca, Cyprus, to Prague, Czech Republic, with a technical stop in Athens. The aircraft was a Boeing 737-300, registration 5B DBY. The flight departed Larnaca at approximately 0907 local time on August 14, 2005, 2 days before West Caribbean Flight 708, carrying 115 passengers and 6 crew. The night before the flight, the aircraft had arrived from London with a maintenance write-up. Crew had reported freezing around the right aft service door and audible banging. Ground Engineer Number 1 at Larnaca conducted an inspection and a pressurization leak check. To perform the check without requiring engine bleed air, he set the pressurization mode selector in the cockpit to manual and used APU air to pressurize the cabin manually. After completing the check, the selector was not returned to auto. The aircraft was released for flight with the selector in manual. The morning's flight crew conducted their pre-flight procedures without noticing the selector position. The aircraft departed and began climbing. 13 minutes into the flight, as the cabin altitude climbed toward dangerous levels, a warning horn sounded in the cockpit. The captain radioed the Helios Operations Center in Larnaca and reported what he described as a takeoff configuration warning, the same horn on the Boeing 737-300 that warns the crew the aircraft is not configured for takeoff when it is still on the ground. In the air, the same horn serves as the cabin altitude warning. The sounds are identical. The captain appears to have fixated on what he believed was an equipment cooling problem, indicated by overhead panel lights. He spoke with the ground engineer who had performed the pressurization check and asked about circuit breakers. The engineer asked directly whether the pressurization panel was set to auto. The captain, by then experiencing early-stage hypoxia, did not address the question and asked instead about circuit breaker locations. That was the last radio contact with the flight deck. The aircraft leveled at 34,000 feet on autopilot. Both pilots succumbed to hypoxia. The aircraft continued flying for approximately 2 hours, completing assigned waypoints, holding altitudes, responding to nothing. The Hellenic Air Force scrambled 2 F-16s. The intercept pilots reported the first officer slumped in the cockpit and the captain's seat empty. One person was observed moving through the cabin, a flight attendant named Andreas Prodromou, 25 years old, who held a commercial pilot certificate. He was unable to gain access to or control the aircraft before both engines flamed out due to fuel exhaustion at approximately 12:04 p.m. The aircraft descended and impacted terrain near Grammatico, northeast of Athens, killing all 121 on board. Greece's Air Accident Investigation and Aviation Safety Board concluded the cause was crew incapacitation due to hypoxia, resulting from the pressurization selector being left in manual following maintenance. Regulatory changes followed, including a Boeing airworthiness directive requiring additional warning lights on 737 Classic variants to make pressurization warnings visually distinct from takeoff configuration warnings. What the investigation could not establish was exactly what Prodromou attempted to do in the final minutes. The intercept images captured his movement, but not his actions. What the captain believed he was hearing during those first critical minutes, and whether a more visually distinct warning system would have produced a different outcome, remains an open question in the safety literature. Comair 5191. Comair Flight 5191 was a regional scheduled service operating as Delta Connection from Lexington, Kentucky to Atlanta, Georgia. The aircraft was a Bombardier CRJ-100, a 50-seat regional jet. The flight was scheduled for a 6 a.m. departure on August 27, 2006. The night shift had one air traffic controller on duty, standard procedure for that hour at Bluegrass Airport. The aircraft taxied from the gate in darkness before civil twilight. The airport has 2 runways, runway 22, 7,003 feet long, and the designated departure runway for the CRJ-100, given the aircraft's weight and prevailing conditions, and runway 26, 3,500 feet long, used primarily by smaller general aviation aircraft. The runways share a taxiway intersection. From the cockpit of an aircraft taxiing at night in low ambient light, the 2 runway entrances are visually similar at certain angles of approach. The crew received clearance for runway 22 and read it back correctly. The cockpit voice recorder confirms this. The aircraft then taxied to and lined up on runway 26. The captain, who was monitoring while the first officer flew, had briefly left the cockpit after lineup to make a flight attendant contact, a routine communication, and returned before thrust was advanced. Neither pilot identified that they were on the wrong runway. Ground radar showed the aircraft accelerating normally on runway 26. Airport surveillance radar tracked the roll. The aircraft reached rotation speed and became briefly airborne. At 6:07 a.m., the radar return from the aircraft disappeared at the far end of the runway boundary. the CRJ-100 struck runway lights, a fence, and terrain beyond. It came down in a field and caught fire. Of the 50 people on board, 49 died. The captain survived. The NTSB investigation identified the probable cause as the crew's failure to verify their position on the airport's surface before beginning the takeoff roll. The airport had no system at the time to alert controllers or crews to wrong runway lineups. No surface detection equipment capable of triggering an alarm for this specific error. Contributing factors included the flight crew's failure to adhere to sterile cockpit procedures during taxi. The cockpit voice recorder captured substantial non-operational conversation during the taxi phase, which is prohibited below 10,000 feet. The captain had also reported only one of his several FAA check ride failures on his ComAir employment application. What the investigation documented carefully, but could not fully explain, was the mechanism of the error in the specific moment of taxi. The Bluegrass Airport taxiway geometry, in 2006, before subsequent infrastructure modifications, made a wrong runway lineup geometrically achievable from a certain taxiway angle. The FAA subsequently required airports above a certain traffic threshold to install runway incursion warning systems. But the individual perceptual sequence, how both pilots taxied to and lined up on a runway whose identifier, when visible, read 26 rather than 22, without either one noting the discrepancy, is documented as a fact in the accident record without a complete cognitive explanation. TAM 3054. TAM Airlines Flight 3054 was a scheduled domestic service from Porto Alegre to São Paulo Congonhas Airport. The aircraft was an Airbus A320-233, registration PR-MBK, that had been in TAM's fleet for 6 months. Congonhas is located inside São Paulo's urban core, surrounded on all sides by buildings and infrastructure. Its main runway, 35L, is 1,945 meters long. The airport was, at the time, the busiest in Brazil. The aircraft had one mechanical condition noted in its dispatch paperwork. The thrust reverser on the number 2 engine was deactivated and mechanically locked. A jammed reverser was a known and legally permissible condition under the minimum equipment list. TAM was permitted to operate with one reverser inactive. Airbus had issued a service bulletin describing a modified landing procedure for this configuration, requiring both thrust levers to be moved to idle at touchdown. TAM had not incorporated the updated procedure into its operations manual. An investigation later found that at least 5 different landing procedures were in use among TAM pilots when operating with one reverser locked out. Runway 35L at Congonhas had been resurfaced in June 2007. The resurfacing had not included cutting drainage grooves into the new surface, a standard practice to reduce hydroplaning. On July 17, 2007, it had been raining for 3 days. Pilots landing ahead of Flight 3054 reported the runway as wet and slippery. When the crew of 3054 requested runway condition information about 90 seconds before touchdown, the controller confirmed it was wet and slippery. The captain exclaimed the phrase aloud before beginning a manual approach. The flight data recorder shows that at touchdown, the left thrust lever was moved to idle and reverse. The right engine thrust lever remained in the climb detent, at partial power. 2 seconds before touchdown, the flight computer had issued 3 successive retard oral warnings, advising the crew to reduce thrust. The warnings stopped when the left lever moved, even though the right lever had not moved. Because the right lever was above idle, the A320's spoiler deployment logic was not satisfied, and the ground spoilers did not extend. The auto brake, also tied to lever position, did not activate. The left engine was in reverse thrust. The right engine was producing forward thrust. The aircraft crossed the runway end at approximately 90 knots. The aircraft continued over a road. It was rush hour on the Avenida Washington Luiz below, cleared the traffic, and struck a 4-story TAM Express cargo warehouse at high speed. The resulting fire was immediately catastrophic. All 187 on board were killed, along with 12 people on the ground, making it the deadliest aviation accident in Brazilian history. CENIPA's final report, released in September 2009, identified the positioning of the right thrust lever as the primary cause. The probability of the right thrust lever being in the climb detent due to a mechanical malfunction was calculated at 1 in 400 billion flight hours, effectively excluding that possibility. The report concluded the configuration resulted from a crew action or inaction. What it could not definitively establish was whether the captain intentionally applied the old procedure he had previously used, believing it would reduce stopping distance in the wet conditions, or whether the lever was left in position inadvertently. The aircraft's auto-throttle logic, which continues to govern engine power even when levers are not physically moved to idle, created a condition where the crew may not have perceived the right engine's thrust through normal tactile or visual cues. Airbus had proposed a warning modification that would have displayed an ECAM alert if a thrust lever was above idle during the landing roll. TAM had not adopted it voluntarily, and it had not been made mandatory by regulators. Air France 447. Air France Flight 447 departed Rio de Janeiro's Galeão Airport on the evening of May 31, 2009, bound for Paris Charles de Gaulle. The aircraft was an Airbus A330-200, registration FGZ-CP. The crew consisted of 3 pilots: Captain Marc Dubois, age 58, with over 11,000 hours; First Officer David Robert, 37, with 6,500 hours; and First Officer Pierre-Cédric Bonin, 32, with 2,900 hours. Dubois was resting in the crew rest area during the overnight crossing, with the 2 junior pilots managing the flight deck. The route took the aircraft over the equatorial Atlantic, through the ITCZ, the Intertropical Convergence Zone, an area of persistent convective activity. At 01:55 UTC, on June 1, 2009, the crew made a routine position report. They were at cruise altitude of 35,000 feet, in smooth air. Approximately 20 minutes later, the aircraft entered an area of active weather. The crew made a course deviation to the right. At 0210 UTC, the speed indications became unreliable. Ice crystals from the storm had blocked all 3 pitot tubes, the forward-facing sensors that measure airspeed by detecting dynamic air pressure. Without valid airspeed data, the autopilot and autothrust disconnected automatically. Bonin, who was the pilot flying, took manual control. In the 27 seconds following autopilot disconnect, Bonin made a series of nose-up inputs. The aircraft climbed from 35,000 feet to approximately 38,000 feet while decelerating. It entered an aerodynamic stall. The stall warning, called a cricket, sounded, a rapid synthetic voice repeating, "Stall, stall." However, the warning system on the A330 had a design behavior that would become significant. If the angle of attack sensors provided readings that the flight computer deemed unreliable, the stall warning was automatically inhibited, even if the aircraft was genuinely stalling. The stall warning activated and deactivated multiple times during the event, depending on the aircraft's speed and what the computers registered. Robert called Dubois and woke him. It took approximately 1 minute and 30 seconds for Dubois to reach the flight deck. By that point, the aircraft had been stalling for over 3 minutes. Throughout this period, Bonin maintained a sustained nose-up side stick input. Robert, at one point, took over the controls and pushed the nose down. The airspeed briefly began recovering, but Bonin simultaneously applied nose-up input from the left side stick. On the A330, both side sticks were active simultaneously, but their inputs were not mechanically linked and were not immediately intuitive for a monitoring pilot to detect. The BEA's final report, published in July 2012, determined the cause was the pitot tube obstruction, leading to unreliable airspeed, followed by the crew's failure to recognize and recover from the stall. The aircraft impacted the Atlantic Ocean at 0214 UTC, 4 minutes and 23 seconds after autopilot disconnect. All 228 people on board were killed. The flight recorders were not located until May 2011, nearly 2 years later, in a search that represented the most extensive deep ocean recovery operation in aviation history at that time. The investigation identified specific behavioral and design factors. The stall warning's inhibition logic, which silenced the alert at the precise moments it might have been most needed, was flagged and subsequently modified. The side stick design, which does not provide direct tactile feedback when both pilots are simultaneously inputting, was examined. The question of why With 3 pilots present and the stall warning sounding repeatedly, the standard recovery procedure was not applied, is the portion of the record that continues to generate analysis. The BEA noted that the crew may not have had a shared, accurate understanding of the aircraft's state. Whether that was a consequence of the warning system behavior, the workload of the event, the altitude and night conditions, or some combination, has not been resolved to a single answer. Colgan 3407. Colgan Air Flight 3407 was operating as Continental Connection Service from Newark, New Jersey to Buffalo Niagara International Airport on the night of February 12, 2009. The aircraft was a Bombardier Dash 8 Q400, a twin-engine turboprop. Captain Marvin Renslow, 47, was at the controls. First Officer Rebecca Shaw, 24, was the monitoring pilot. Between them, they had approximately 3,700 combined flight hours, a ratio of experience far lower than would have been typical for this equipment type a decade earlier. The flight was delayed significantly at Newark due to weather and ground congestion. The crew spent extended time in the crew lounge before departure. The cockpit voice recorder captured conversations suggesting fatigue. Shaw had commuted from her home near Seattle to Newark the previous day to reach the flight. During the taxi, cruise, and approach phases, the crew engaged in sustained personal conversation, covering relationships, career frustrations, and the economics of regional aviation. FAA regulations prohibit non-operational conversation below 10,000 feet, the sterile cockpit rule, and that prohibition was continuously in effect during several minutes of off-topic discussion on approach. The aircraft was established on the ILS approach to runway 23 in icing conditions. Buffalo approach radar was monitoring. At the outer marker, the crew extended landing gear and flaps and reduced thrust. Airspeed began decaying. The Q400 had an icing reference speed switch that, when activated for icing conditions, increases the speed at which the stick shaker, the stall warning, triggers. The switch was active. The crew did not discuss adjusting their approach speed upward for icing conditions, which would have been the appropriate action. At 22:16:53 local time, at approximately 2,400 feet above the ground and about 5 miles from the runway threshold, the stick shaker activated. The autopilot disconnected automatically. Renslow's response was to pull back on the control column, a nose-up input. This is the opposite of the train's stall recovery procedure, which requires pitch down to reduce angle of attack and recover airspeed. When the stick shaker activated, the aircraft was not yet in an aerodynamic stall. The warning system triggers before the actual stall to provide recovery margin. Renslow's nose-up input drove the aircraft into the actual stall. The stick pusher, a more forceful automated system that physically pushes the nose down, activated 3 times. Renslow continued pulling against it. Shaw simultaneously retracted the flaps, which increased the aircraft's stall speed and deepened the stall. The aircraft rolled left to approximately 45 degrees, pitched nose down, and descended into a house at 6038 Long Street in Clarence Center. The elapsed time from stick shaker activation to ground impact was 27 seconds. All 49 people on board were killed, along with 1 resident in the house. The NTSB investigation was among the most comprehensive the agency had conducted, extending well beyond the cockpit events to examine regional airline industry structure, pilot pay, fatigue regulations, training standards, and hiring practices. Renslow's training record showed multiple FAA check ride failures, not all of which had been accurately disclosed on his employment application. The investigation found his pattern of failures suggested difficulty under non-routine pressure. What the record cannot fully answer is the precise cognitive mechanism of his response to the stick shaker, whether it was a reflex carried over from a different aircraft type, a pure startle response, or something else. The NTSB noted that pulling against a stick shaker, while almost uniformly incorrect, is not as rare a response as training programs assume. Several other accidents and incidents reflect the same behavior under comparable conditions. AirAsia 8501. AirAsia Indonesia Flight QZ8501 departed Surabaya's Juanda Airport at 0536 local time on December 28, 2014, bound for Singapore's Changi Airport. The aircraft was an Airbus A320-200, registration PKAXC. Captain Irianto, 53, had 20,537 flight hours. First Officer Remy Emmanuel Plessel, 46, had 2,275 hours. The flight carried 155 passengers and 7 crew. The routing took the aircraft over the Java Sea in weather conditions that included active convective development, thunderstorms building rapidly in the morning hours. The crew requested a route deviation on departure and a higher cruise altitude to avoid the weather. Initial requests were denied due to traffic. Clearance for a deviation was eventually approved. At 0612 local time, the crew made a routine communication. At 0616, the crew again requested a higher altitude. The request was not immediately confirmed. At 0617, the aircraft disappeared from radar. Secondary radar contact was lost within seconds. The aircraft was found in the Java Sea 2 days later, in approximately 30 meters of water. The wreckage distribution and flight recorder data provided a detailed reconstruction. The Indonesia National Transportation Safety Committee investigation found that the aircraft had experienced a recurring failure in the rudder travel limiter unit, a component that regulates the range of rudder deflection to prevent structural overload at high speeds. Maintenance records showed this fault had activated at least 23 times in the preceding year. On each previous occasion, the fault had been cleared by a reset. On the day of the accident, maintenance records indicated the fault had been addressed in a way consistent with temporary workarounds rather than an approved definitive repair. During the flight, the rudder limiter fault activated again. The crew's response included pulling the circuit breakers associated with the flight augmentation computers. This action, in the A320's system architecture, can cause the flight augmentation computers to reset, and under certain conditions, leads to the autopilot disconnecting. After the circuit breakers were pulled, the aircraft entered an attitude from which the crew did not recover. Flight data showed a rapid roll and pitch up that produced forces exceeding the aircraft's structural limits. The aircraft broke apart before ocean impact. The NTSC concluded the probable cause was the crew's response to the rudder limiter fault, which led to a loss of control. The investigation highlighted maintenance practices around the recurring fault as a contributing factor, noting that temporary resets had been used instead of a definitive repair that might have required removing the aircraft from service. The report also noted that pulling circuit breakers was not a documented, approved procedure for addressing the fault in question. What the investigation could not establish with certainty was whether the circuit breaker action was improvised in the moment, whether it was a technique the crew had used before on previous occurrences of the same recurring fault, or whether it had been learned informally from other crew members. The 23 previous activations of the same fault, each addressed by a reset, represent a documented pattern that raised questions about how recurring faults are tracked, escalated, and resolved at the operator level. Those questions were addressed in safety recommendations, but not definitively answered in terms of what specifically drove the crew's decision in those final minutes. TransAsia 235. TransAsia Airways Flight GE 235 departed Taipei's Songshan Airport at 10:51 local time on February 4, 2015. The aircraft was an ATR 72-600, a twin-engine turboprop, registration B22816. The flight was a short domestic service to Kinmen Island, carrying 53 passengers and 5 crew. It was a clear morning. The aircraft had just completed its takeoff roll on runway 10 and had retracted its gear, beginning the initial climb over the Keelung River on the standard departure track. Approximately 37 seconds after liftoff, at an altitude of about 1,200 feet, the flight data recorder logged an anomaly on engine number 1, the left engine. An auto-flight mode transition occurred simultaneously. The ECAM, the Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitor, generated a warning. The ATR 72-600 is equipped with dual-engine FADEC systems, and the warning required the crew to identify and respond to the affected engine. The crew's response was to reduce power on engine number 2, the right engine. Engine number 2 was operating normally. Engine number 1, the engine with the anomaly, continued in its abnormal state. With the right engine at reduced power and the left engine degraded, the aircraft could not maintain altitude or controlled flight. It entered a roll to the left. Surveillance cameras on the Huandong Bridge and a passing vehicle's dashcam recorded the subsequent seconds. The aircraft's left wingtip contacted the bridge structure at low speed. The aircraft then inverted partially and descended into the Keelung River, coming to rest on its side in shallow water. Of the 58 people on board, 43 were killed. 15 survivors were rescued from the water. The Aviation Safety Council of Taiwan confirmed through flight data recorder analysis that Engine 1 had entered an automated protection mode related to the power lever's position after the auto flight mode transition. The ECAM warning had presented. The crew then reduced power on Engine 2. The flight recorder sequence is unambiguous. The investigation concluded the crew had shut down the wrong engine following the auto flight mode change, and that training on the ATR 72-600, which the crew had recently completed as a type transition, had deficiencies in preparing pilots for concurrent abnormal events at very low altitude immediately after takeoff. The question left partially unresolved is the cognitive mechanism of the error. The ATR 72-600's ECAM presents information in a specific format during engine anomalies, and analysis focused on whether the presentation of the warning, combined with a simultaneous auto-flight mode change, could create ambiguity about which engine was affected during a high workload moment in the critical initial climb phase. The investigation documented the training deficiency and the ECAM format as factors. It did not produce a complete explanation of how a crew with recent type certification identified and then acted on the wrong engine in a matter of seconds, at an altitude that provided no margin for recovery. Germanwings 9525. Germanwings Flight 9525 was a scheduled service from Barcelona's El Prat Airport to Dusseldorf, Germany. The aircraft was an Airbus A320, registration DAIPX. Captain Patrick Sondheimer, 34, had 6,763 flight hours. First Officer Andreas Lubitz, 27, had 630 hours. The flight departed Barcelona at 10:01 local time. The Barcelona to Dusseldorf leg was the return flight of a same-day pairing. The outbound flight from Dusseldorf had been uneventful. The aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude of 38,000 feet and reached cruise approximately 20 minutes into the flight. At 10:27 UTC, Captain Sondheimer left the flight deck, a standard procedure during cruise phase, requiring coordination with the pilot remaining at the controls. The cockpit door locked from inside. In the Airbus cockpit door security system, the pilot at the controls can secure the door and prevent external entry for a period of approximately 5 minutes in response to an entry request. The door's emergency entry code, available to crew outside, can be overridden from inside the cockpit. On radar, the aircraft began descending at 10:30 UTC. The descent rate was approximately 3,500 feet per minute, within the normal range for a managed descent. The track heading was consistent, initially, with a possible diversion towards several airports in the region. As altitude continued to fall and no diversion course was established, Marseille Area Control attempted contact. Multiple attempts on standard frequency and the emergency frequency 121.5 received no response. No transponder code change to 7700, the universal emergency squawk, was made. The cockpit voice recorder captured Sondheimer returning to the door at approximately 10:31. He attempted the standard entry request. No response from inside. He attempted the emergency entry code. The sound of the code being entered is captured on the CVR. The door did not open. The CVR recorded regular breathing from the cockpit throughout the descent. The aircraft maintained its programmed descent at a consistent rate. At 10:40 UTC, the terrain proximity warning system activated. At 10:41 UTC, the aircraft impacted the Massif des Trois Évêchés range at approximately 430 knots, at an elevation of 6,560 feet. All 150 people on board were killed. The BEA confirmed through CVR analysis that the first officer was conscious throughout the entire descent. German prosecutors reviewed the same evidence and reached a criminal determination. The post-accident investigation also found that Lubitz had been evaluated by multiple physicians in the preceding months, had received diagnoses that investigators found documented in his apartment, and had been given medical notes indicating he should not be flying in the period leading up to the accident. This documentation was not shared with Germanwings or Lufthansa. because German medical privacy law did not require or permit its transmission to employers. Regulatory changes in Europe followed the accident, including requirements for two-person cockpit occupancy at all times. Discussions about medical information sharing frameworks between aviation medical examiners and airlines produced new guidance in several jurisdictions. What remains structurally unresolved is whether any configuration of the information that existed across medical and administrative systems would have altered the specific timeline of events. The information about Lubitz's condition was present. It existed in multiple places simultaneously. It was not communicated across institutional boundaries. Whether a regulatory framework permitting such communication would have changed the outcome is a conditional question that the record addresses through recommendations, but cannot answer with certainty. Ethiopian 302. Ethiopian Airlines Flight ET302 was a scheduled international service from Addis Ababa's Bole Airport to Nairobi's Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. The aircraft was a Boeing 737 MAX 8, registration ETAVJ, which had been in Ethiopia's fleet for 5 months. The flight departed at 0838 local time on March 10, 2019. It was carrying 157 passengers and crew from 35 countries. Captain Yared Getachew, 29, had 8,122 flight hours. First Officer Ahmed Noor Mohammed, 25, had 361 hours. Radar data from Addis Ababa Approach Control showed the aircraft immediately after takeoff behaving inconsistently with a normal climb profile. Altitude readouts fluctuated. Airspeed indications were erratic. Within the first minute, the crew noted a control anomaly, and the captain reported flight control problems to the tower, requesting to return to the airport. Approach Control cleared the aircraft to return. Radar tracked the aircraft through a left banking turn, consistent with an attempted return to Bole. The aircraft is equipped with a system called the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, MCAS. This system was introduced on the 737 MAX because the new CFM LEAP 1B engines, larger than those on previous 737 variants and repositioned forward on the wing, altered the aircraft's aerodynamic characteristics at high angles of attack. MCAS was designed to automatically trim the nose down under specific conditions to prevent an aerodynamic stall. It received its input from a single angle of attack sensor. On flight ET302, that sensor was providing an erroneous reading from shortly after liftoff. MCAS activated repeatedly, commanding nose-down stabilizer trim. The crew applied nose-up electric trim and initially managed to counteract the system. At 084020 UTC, they disengaged the stab trim cutout switches, a procedure consistent with the runaway stabilizer non-normal checklist, which was the approved response for uncommanded trim movement. Following cutout, however, conditions including very high airspeed made it mechanically extremely difficult to move the stabilizer using the manual trim wheels, as the aerodynamic forces acting on the stabilizer at that speed were substantial. The crew attempted to briefly re-engage electric trim, which MCAS used to apply further nose-down input. The aircraft entered a steep dive. Radar tracked the descent to ground impact at 0844 UTC. The elapsed time from wheels up to impact was 6 minutes and 34 seconds. All 157 people on board were killed. The Ethiopian Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, with participation from the NTSB, FAA, Boeing, and international bodies, found that the erroneous angle of attack sensor triggered MCAS repeatedly, and that the system's design, relying on a single sensor and possessing authority sufficient to overcome crew inputs, was flawed. The investigation also found that information about MCAS had not been included in pilot training materials or flight manuals in a way that would have given crews specific knowledge of the system or procedures for addressing its activation. This was the second 737 MAX crash in 5 months. Lion Air Flight 610 had killed 189 people over the Java Sea on October 29, 2018. Under an essentially identical sequence of sensor failure and MCAS activation. The 737 MAX was grounded worldwide in March 2019 and remained grounded for 20 months. Boeing redesigned MCAS to require input from both angle of attack sensors and implemented limits on the system's total trim authority. the FAA restructured its Organization Designation Authorization Framework, under which Boeing had been delegated significant portions of its own certification oversight. The technical cause was documented clearly and specifically. The institutional dimension, what was known about MCAS's design characteristics at what point in the certification timeline, and how that information moved through regulatory and corporate decision-making processes, was examined in congressional hearings and Inspector General reports. Those hearings produced specific documented findings. Whether those findings represent a complete accounting remains a question that legal proceedings, ongoing after the aircraft's return to service, have continued to examine.